Since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in early 2022, the Kremlin has done a good job of insulating ordinary Russians from the costs of the war. Clever monetary policy dampened the effects of sanctions, defence-related spending triggered a mini-economic boom, and Ukraine's occasional incursions into Russian territory were ultimately snuffed out. However, this might be about to change. In recent months, Ukraine's strike on oil refineries have pushed up fuel prices across Russia, triggering shortages and rekindling inflation-related anxieties about the wider Russian economy. So in this video, we're going to take a look at how Ukraine manufactured a fuel crisis in Russia, and why this leaves both the Kremlin and the Russian central bank with uncomfortable dilemmas. Never miss an episode and always feel in the loop by subscribing and ringing the bell. So, to understand how Ukraine's strikes are affecting Russia, you need to know a bit about the oil industry. In short, when oil is pumped straight out of the ground, it's an unhelpful mix of different hydrocarbons that can't really be immediately used for anything, hence why it's called crude oil. Crude oil thus needs to be separated into usable petroleum products, like gasoline and diesel, and this process happens at refineries. Generally speaking, about 50% of the crude oil is turned into gasoline, 25% is turned into diesel, 10% is turned into jet fuel, the remainder is turned into funkier petroleum products with more specific uses. Anyway, as you probably already know, Russia produces a lot of crude oil, mostly via its oil fields in western Siberia. According to data from the EIA, Russia produced about 9.2 million barrels of crude oil a day in 2024, making it the third largest producer in the world after the US and Saudi Arabia. Slightly more than half of this crude oil, about 4.8 million barrels per day in 2024, is exported in unrefined form to third countries like China and India, who then refine that crude oil into usable petroleum products, which are then consumed domestically or exported again. The remainder, however, about 4.4 million barrels per day in 2024, is refined inside Russia. Most of this is then consumed by Russians, but some is exported as refined product to other countries like Turkey. In 2024, for instance, 3.9 million barrels per day were consumed domestically, while the remaining 500,000 were exported. Anyway, to this end, there were about 30 large oil refineries in Russia, mostly in the west of the country near the population centres, which are connected to the western Siberian oil fields via a network of pipelines. For the past 2 months or so, Ukraine has been targeting these refineries with long-range drones. At least 16 have been hit, some multiple times, and Ukraine has successfully carried out strikes against targets thousands of kilometres away, including the Neftekhim Salavat refinery in Bashkortostan. Estimates vary, but most analysts think Ukraine's strikes have disrupted between 15 and 25% of Russia's overall refining capacity. Unsurprisingly, this has triggered a dramatic decline in diesel and gasoline production, pushing up prices. Russia has recently banned diesel and gasoline exports to increase domestic supply, but this hasn't really worked. Wholesale gasoline prices have risen by about 40% in recent months and are now at record highs, according to data from the St. Petersburg Exchange. This is obviously bad news for ordinary Russians, but it's also bad news for the Kremlin because of how higher fuel prices interact with Russia's pre-existing inflation problem. For context, thanks to a dramatic increase in defence-related spending and the ruble's post-invasion depreciation, inflation has been running hot in Russia for really the past 2 years, with year-on-year inflation rising from a low of 2.3% in April 2023 to over 7% throughout 2024, and then a new high of 10.3% in March 2025. To bring inflation down, the Russian central bank hiked interest rates from 7.5% in 2023 to a high of 21% in late 2024, making it more attractive to save rather than spend rubles, and reducing aggregate demand and therefore inflation. While these super steep rate hikes succeeded in bringing down inflation, which has now fallen for 5 consecutive months to a recent low of 8.1% in August, they also dampened growth. And there were fears that the Russian economy was headed for a recession earlier this year. This is why the Russian central bank started cutting rates earlier this year, even though inflation was still running above 8%, more than double the central bank's target of 4%. They basically decided that, in the short term, avoiding a recession was more important than bringing inflation down to target. Anyway, if this recent spike in fuel prices pushes inflation back up, the central bank will be faced with an even more acute dilemma. Either they hike rates again, which would bring down inflation but risk pushing the Russian economy into a recession, or they continue with their rate-cutting cycle, which would encourage growth but risk letting inflation rise to destabilizing levels. This is probably why, instead of letting prices at the pump rise, as you'd expect them to when wholesale prices are going up, Russian authorities have instead essentially capped prices, mostly via anti-monopoly regulation that limit how quickly individual petrol stations can raise their prices. Prices have still risen, but not by as much as you'd expect given the supply issues, and this has led to shortages across Russia. In certain regions, price caps have led to a parallel black market where you can get a sense of the actual market value of fuel at the moment. In the occupied territory of Crimea, for instance, the local government imposed a price cap of 76 rubles for gasoline and a 30-litre limit per motorist. This led to widespread shortages, with roughly half the petrol stations in Crimea just shutting down, and a black market for gasoline coupons where gasoline trades for as much as 125 rubles. In the past couple of days, there have even been reports that Russia is planning to import fuel from countries like Belarus, China and Singapore. But while this might ameliorate any shortages, fuel costs about 50% more on international markets than it currently does inside Russia. And if this increase is passed on to consumers, it'll trigger a dramatic uptick in inflation. Now, to be clear, these strikes aren't going to bankrupt the Kremlin, not least because Russia can just export the excess crude. Nonetheless, it creates a difficult dilemma for both the Russian central bank, which has to decide between inflation and recession, and the Russian authorities, which have to decide between shortages and higher prices. Moreover, it's the most effective way Ukraine has found so far of making ordinary Russians feel the costs of war. If Ukraine can hold its own on the battlefield, and the underwhelming result from Russia's so-called summer offensive, especially around Pokrovsk, suggests it can, then Ukraine will go into winter in a better position than is often implied. Russia's military has apparently been neutralized, and Ukraine can continue to exert pressure on the Kremlin by targeting infrastructure inside Russia, maybe even with the help of new long-range missiles from its Western partners. Ultimately, we live in a world where growing geopolitical and economical issues like these are hitting the headlines every day. While it's easy to sometimes feel overwhelmed, there are ways to stay sharp, and we know that the easiest way to do so is by using Brilliant. That's because Brilliant teaches you by doing, using active learning techniques to train you in the principles behind otherwise complex subjects, and ensuring that you actually understand what's going on. With our ever-growing collection of lessons in topics ranging from maths to science to AI, there's plenty to get you started. Not only does each lesson offer a comprehensive mix of engaging problems and competitive features, but Brilliant also helps you stay consistent, keeping you motivated and excited to learn every single day. Take their newly updated science courses, for example. Here you can learn how to build simple computers out of logic gates, or open your eyes to the world around you by solving puzzles with science. Each lesson will help you develop your scientific intuition through visual interactive problem solving that gets you hands-on with key concepts. Try Brilliant for free and start your learning journey today by visiting brilliant.org/TLDR, scanning the QR code on screen, or clicking the link in the description. By doing so, you'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription, and they'll know that you came from us, which really helps us out.